It's a wild world out there, but some worlds are even wilder. Hi, I'm Tyler Habney, and you're listening to Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome back to Dungeons and Dystopias. I am your host and typical game master. I have DM'd over 200 games combined of Dungeons and Dragons and Cyberpunk Red, and I am here to share my thoughts. So let's get into it. Today's episode is going to be a little bit less about the actual contents of the game, and I think more about how to play them or how to get started, which I think is a necessary episode to have at some point. Maybe we're a little late with it, but at the same time, you know, a lot of this stuff is sort of not necessarily a given, if that makes sense. So obviously, when it comes to playing tabletop role-playing games, the most immediate answer would be the tabletop, meaning getting together 4 or so of your friends, maybe more, maybe less, sitting together at a table. Maybe you have a map drawn out on like grid paper or note paper or something. And then you're just kind of going at it. You could also do theater of mind. If you're good at describing things, you can just rely on your players' minds to try and fill in the gaps where a typical battle map might be able to do that. And that does bring us on to the other concept of battle maps. If you're not using theater of mind, you need a map preferably with some kind of grid. Each unit in the grid should represent some form of movement or sort of space, and then you can design the map around that. A lot of people will just use notebooks, printer paper, marker. They'll make, basic shapes of kind of what the building looks like. Like a let's say we're doing a warehouse, it'd probably be a square. Maybe if there's like a couple of chemical vats, put some circles in that square. Make sure the measurement is right for what you want the warehouse size to be compared to all the different units of your grid paper. And then from there, you can just put Monopoly board pieces on the sheet to represent your players. And that is really the most simple way of doing Dungeons and Dragons. And it's technically something you can just kind of do on the fly. If you have like a roll of printer paper, you just rip something off. And if you need a building of whatever certain size, you can just draw it out. And that's very free form. It lets you kind of create a lot of things as you go. It is not really the way I play, though. So I use what is, I guess, the more modern form of this tabletop game. And I use Roll20, or I use a virtual tabletop, which we have talked about, I do believe, in the very first episode. But obviously, we didn't really discuss exactly what goes into making a proper virtual tabletop. And really, honestly, a virtual tabletop it's not that much similar from your regular tabletop, only it uses computer files and tools to kind of help along with that journey. So the one I use is Roll20. I primarily use that one because I have a subscription to it. I used to use Foundry, but when I changed computers, something happened with my Foundry system, and I cannot connect to the internet through Foundry anymore. It's all closed out, and I'm too scared to figure out how to port forward it at the moment. But Roll20 has been working out just fine. I have a lot of different games in Roll20, which is another big benefit of Roll20 is that a lot of these game creators have forms of their system inside of Roll20, or a lot of these virtual tabletops will have officially licensed versions of these tabletop role-playing games, because a lot of the people who make these also play them. And during COVID, everyone realized how huge a virtual tabletop could be. So people got into that. And Roll20 is, in my opinion, probably one of the easier ones to use. Everything is sort of saved to a cloud server, so you have a certain amount of space that you can upload, images, GIFs, files, whatever, and you can use that to build your game. You can use that to sort of build up different maps and characters and tokens and stuff. And it all works out really easy. It's just drag and drop. But obviously, with everything, there are some negatives. Roll20 doesn't have the exact express multitude of features something like Foundry might have. Foundry is a one-time purchase rather than a subscription model. It's only, I think it's about $30-$60, somewhere in that region. You only have to purchase it once, and only the DM has to purchase it. So really, the players don't even need to own Foundry. Just one person needs to purchase it, whoever's setting the server up and going to be setting up the game. So Foundry is really good for financial purposes. It also has an abundance of different modules and things you can do that help change the system of Foundry and the functionality of everything, which is super important. Really, at the end of the day, a lot of those modules become absolutely crucial to playing your game, because sometimes you can be able to basically build sort of set pieces or maps or whatever around these large sort of concepts that are built off of these modules. There's a module that allows parallax movement, allows one side of the picture to come up to the top as you're sort of looping, so it's just a constant moving picture, which is not something you can do in Roll20, not by a long shot. So really, at the end of the day, Foundry it's definitely a lot more complex. There's a lot more you can do with Foundry, but at the same time, it's just there's a lot more that goes into learning how to work Foundry, and you do, in my experience, have to have a little bit of the sort of IT knowledge when it comes to how to actually get the thing operating. And that's knowledge I don't personally have. So that's why I haven't really been using Foundry. It's because I can't. But yeah, there are a lot of other systems out there. There's Kobold Fight Club. I think they have their own. D&D just dropped their own, I believe. Fantasy Grounds. Oh man, there's a lot. But primarily the ones I use are Roll20 and Foundry. So that's your your virtual tabletops. When you're getting involved with either of them, I'd definitely look at a lot of different tutorials, because Roll20 at its base is pretty simple, but there are some pretty complex maneuvers you can do in Roll20 itself. It's not necessarily a bare bones platform. There's quite a bit to it, and in fact, they are growing. They have character importers now with a service called Demiplane, which Roll20 has purchased. They also just recently added this sort of create your own dungeon system, which I thought was really cool. So obviously Roll20 does have its own benefits and features over Foundry, but because of that subscription, you will probably wind up paying more for 1 year of Foundry than you would for, initially buying, or 1 year of Roll20 instead of initially buying Foundry. That's just economics. So when it comes to actually getting, when you've chosen your form, I guess, the idea then would be to choose what game you want to play. Presumably you've already got at least a couple of people who are interested in playing a tabletop role-playing game, if not a specific one. Sometimes people just want to get together and do this kind of group activity, but they don't exactly know what they want to do. And because of that, everyone just kind of hops on to the most popular option, which is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. So yes, if you want to play the most popular option and you're into Tolkien-esque fantasy and all that stuff, Dungeons and Dragons is the system for you. Hands down, it's very open-ended, I guess, when it comes to the types of fantasy you can play. There's a lot of different spells. There's a lot to learn. You can spend the next few years mastering Dungeons and Dragons, but some games or some tables, what they'll do is they only know Dungeons and Dragons, but they really want to play some like futuristic sci-fi game, which really would probably be best played in Shadowrun or Cyberpunk, or Sprawl Runners or any of the other cyberpunk type things out there. But what they do is they modify 5e, which that's fine. 5e as a system is relatively modifiable, but at the same time, there are plenty of options out there, and not only just necessarily mainstream people like Artal Sorian or Wizards of the Coast, but there are a lot of really good indie role-playing games out there as well. One in particular I've been paying attention to is Capers. And the concept of Capers is it's basically superheroes in the 1920s during Prohibition, or the 1930s. 1920s. And it's really interesting. There's a lot of cool things you can do with Capers, but it's obviously a type of game. You don't necessarily come to your friend group and be like, hey, I want to start a group for a bunch of 1920s superhero mobsters or superpowered detectives. Some people would probably say yes or no, but at the end of the day, a lot of times people just go for Dungeons and Dragons. So that's kind of my sort of rant when it comes to picking games. I would say there's more than fantasy out there. Dungeons and Dragons is really good. It's a solid system. There's a lot you can do with it. You can play it for years and still have fun. There's a lot of different stories, and the Forgotten Realms setting is amazing. But, if you're playing a sci-fi game, probably play Cyberpunk, Blade Runner, Shadowrun, any of the other ones that are specifically built for that interest, rather than trying to build an entire system yourself, which is cool to do. It just takes a lot more effort. And some of these systems, like Cyberpunk, can be modified pretty easily to fit whatever setting, because I find Cyberpunk shooting really works out. So maybe I want to play a more modern, gritty sort of setting. Well, I could do that with either Savage Worlds or take Cyberpunk, just maybe, dissuade people or ban the cyberware, and you'd still have a very decent sort of game you could play. In fact, that's something I'm doing with Cyberpunk now. I'm doing a Batman campaign in Gotham, and my players are not supervillains or superheroes, but they're just the goons that are in these various superhero or supervillain squads, and they're sort of being able to work kind of mercenary style between all of these different characters, and Gotham's kind of growing around them, and it's really interesting. But there's no cyberware, but it uses Cyberpunk Red, and that's created an entirely new, different feel for the system, which I would not be able to acquire whatsoever with Dungeons & Dragons 5e. So that's what I'm saying. Just think about what type of game you want to play, and if it's fantasy, D&D. If it isn't fantasy, consider something that is not Dungeons & Dragons. So once you have your game chosen, now comes the moment of truth. This is the area where most people fall apart. Most groups don't make it past this part. Scheduling. Yeah, that's a dirty word in the tabletop role-playing game community, because let me tell you, there will always be scheduling conflicts. There will never not be scheduling conflicts. It's an inherent truth within us that there is going to be at some point a severe scheduling conflict. But the real test of a true good group is whether or not you can weather that storm and figure it out. there is a bit of compromise that comes when it comes to actually creating a schedule. A lot of people, what they'll do is they will say, "Oh, we're going to get together, maybe every other week, every month or something," and then they don't keep on top of it, and the game falls apart. If you want your game to keep running, I would encourage you sincerely to have a very consistent schedule when you have your players understand that this is when the game is happening, and that's kind of what I do. I run my games on Wednesdays and Saturdays. That's how it's been for quite a while, and it's worked out decently. We've obviously had to cancel some days because no one can show up, but that is fine because there will always be next week. So if you can make it past scheduling, then it is on for the game master to use their brain to determine what the story is, how that goes, whether use the resources available to them to create the story for the players. I mean, that's just Dungeons and Dragons, it's D&D, it's Cyberpunk, that's all the tabletop role-playing games. So, I mean, really, that's pretty much how you get started. Get everyone together, bring snacks, maybe a little bit of beer, something to spend the time with, and have some laughs. Obviously, if you are running any of these systems, it is encouraged for you to have the rule book at hand. Trust me, even as a game master of now over 7 years, I still refer to the rule book pretty consistently when I'm making rulings, just because I don't want to go against what the book says, primarily. So yeah, that's basically kind of how you get started in tabletop games in general, whether or not you're doing sort of in person or you're going virtual tabletop. I would definitely recommend you check out any of the VTTs I named. Obviously, I use Roll20 the most. It's the one I know. But Foundry is also really good. Digital Fight Club, Kobold Foundry. I've heard they're all really, really solid. So personally, or Fantasy Grounds, I think is another one. Just got to throw those out there. Good choices, all of them. For now, though, we're going to get to the Monster of the Week, and since this was supposed to be a D&D episode, we are going to do a D&D Monster of the Week. And today, I mean, this one probably has to be one of the more standard creatures in D&D, but it's obviously one, if you've paid attention to any Dungeons & Dragons meme you've heard of, it's the Mimic. Mimics are creatures who are, I guess they're purple, full of eyes in their natural form, but really a mimic, it takes the form of something else. They don't really have a natural form. So a mimic is most often a treasure chest. And you'll, as a player or an adventurer, approach said treasure chest, try to open it, find your hand is stuck, and then the treasure chest will grow eyes, teeth, and limbs, and then try to eat you. It's terrifying. If you look up some footage, I'm almost positive they had mimics in, it was Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne or something. They're about the same. And mimics, that's the best part about them is you can really have a mimic of anything. It doesn't have to be a treasure chest. People have put mimics as doors, as tables, as entire houses before. Gold coin mimics are very fun because, they could just pop out and try to bite one of your players' fingers off when they're trying to pay for health potions or something. It could all lead to really funny circumstances. But obviously, they do have weaknesses. And my weakness is magical weapons. They are going to generally die just about as easy as any other creature. They don't exactly have a ton of immunities or resistances, except for to magical things, obviously. But yeah, generally, if you're a dungeon master and you're trying to induce paranoia in your players, just throw just a ton of mimics at them at once and then stop for a while. They won't know you stopped, but just stop for a bit. That'll be this week's Monster of the Week and this week's episode. Please come back next week where we talk a little bit more about Cyberpunk Red. I have been Tyler Hapney. This has been Dungeons and Dystopias. Thank you so much for listening.